What if humanity's greatest weapon wasn't built in labs or forges, but in the darkness of slavery itself? What if desperation, real, bone-deep desperation, could turn miners and colonists into something the galaxy's most powerful empire had never encountered before, an enemy willing to die just to prove they mattered? Today, you're about to witness the moment 200 years of human sacrifice detonated in the face of absolute power. And the eternal throne will never see it coming. The Defiant flew on into the future, not in hiding, not in darkness, but as a symbol that empires can fall, that the impossible can be made to break, that even the smallest species can reshape the galaxy if they refuse to accept the narrative written for them. But this is only the beginning. The throne hasn't fallen yet. The war for galactic liberation has just ignited. And humanity, small, fragile, desperate humanity, has become the spark that lights the fire. If you believe in stories where the underdog doesn't just survive but transforms the entire order of things, if you believe in humanity's capacity to defy the impossible, like and subscribe for more HFY tales that remind us why we matter. Drop a comment. What would you do if your species faced extinction? Would you accept it or would you fight? Tell me in the comments below. Check out our latest video on your screen now, another HFY story that will blow your mind. Join our community and become part of something bigger. A community that believes in human potential against all odds. The galaxy is watching. The throne is preparing for war. And humanity is ready. See what happens when an empire believes itself eternal. Not just powerful. Not merely superior in firepower or technology or numbers. But eternal. Unchanging. Beyond the reach of consequence. What happens to a civilization that has crushed every rival, absorbed every rebellion, and turned the very concept of resistance into a historical curiosity, something whispered about in museums, not feared in the streets? They forget to be afraid. They forget that empires are not forged from the stars themselves. They are built on the bones of those beneath them. And bone eventually can break back. The mine shaft descends 3 kilometers into the red soil of Kepler 442b, and the air down there tastes like rust and ash. It tastes like hopelessness. Marcus Chen had been working this same shaft for 14 years. 14 years of drilling into rock, of hauling or carts, of breathing air so thick with mineral dust that every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. He was 43 years old. In the eyes of the eternal throne, that made him middle-aged. In the eyes of the mine, that made him almost spent. The work lights cast harsh shadows across the cavern. Thousands of humans moved through the darkness like insects, mechanized, purposeful, broken. Around them, the autonomous drones worked in perfect synchronization, their movements fluid and efficient. They never tired. They never complained. They never wondered if there was anything more to existence than this. That's why the throne was phasing them in. Marcus knew this because everyone knew this. Knowledge traveled through the colonies like poison through water, slowly, inevitably, until it was everywhere. The throne's decree had been transmitted 6 months ago, official and cold. Within 3 years, human labor would be entirely replaced by mechanical systems. Cheaper, more reliable. No needs, no dependencies, no capacity for the kind of stubborn, illogical rebellion that had haunted human populations across the galaxy for generations. No need for humans at all. The shift horn blared, a sound like something dying. Marcus and hundreds of others set down their tools and began the long climb back to the surface. His daughter would be waiting at the settlement. She was 7 years old. Her name was Sarah. She asked too many questions. Questions like, "Daddy, why do we live under the ground?" And "Daddy, when can we see the stars?" And "Daddy, do we matter?" That last one was the hardest to answer. The sky above Kepler 442b was perpetually rust-colored, perpetually dim. The throne had chosen this planet for mining specifically because the conditions were harsh enough that the automated systems would be stressed to their limits, a good test bed before rolling out their replacement technology across the entire colonial sphere. It also ensured that no human would have the energy or resources to cause trouble. The settlement itself was a sprawl of prefabricated modules, living quarters, medical facilities, minimal, food processors rationed, and administrative buildings where throne overseers sat in climate-controlled comfort and watched humanity winding down. Marcus moved through the narrow streets with thousands of others, all dressed in the same gray work suits, all moving with the same exhausted shuffle. They were ghosts. They had become ghosts without even dying. His residential unit was Module 7 to 447. Inside, Sarah sat on the narrow bed, swinging her legs. She had her mother's eyes, dark, intelligent, refusing to accept the world as it was presented to her. "Daddy's home," she said. Not a greeting. An observation. A small act of defiance against the assumption that this routine was normal. "I'm home," Marcus confirmed, sitting beside her. His bones ached. Everything ached. "When are we leaving?" Sarah asked. The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Leaving where?" Marcus asked carefully. "Here. Kepler 442b. The mine. All of it. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to see the stars. Real stars, not just on the screens they show us in school." Marcus looked at his daughter, this small human who's already learning the fundamental lesson of their species' place in the galaxy. We are nothing. We are acceptable only insofar as we are useful. When we stop being useful, we stop being acceptable. "Maybe someday," he said, pulling her close. But both of them knew the truth. There was no someday. There was only this. This mine. This colony. This slow, systematic erasure of everything that had ever made humanity feel like it mattered. Above the planet, in a crystalline station that hung in the void like a jewel, a throne administrator named Velkareth watched the colony through 100 different sensors. He watched the humans work. He watched them file through the settlement. He watched them sit in their tiny rooms and stare at walls. They were so small, so fragile, so utterly, completely insignificant. The throne, the vast, glittering civilization that had dominated this region of space for 3,000 years, had conquered with such overwhelming force that warfare had become almost extinct. Populations submitted not because they were brave, but because they were reasonable. What was the point of fighting something so vast, so eternal, so completely incapable of failure? Humans had tried back in the early days, back when they still had ships and weapons and the arrogance of a species that believed it could make a difference. Those rebellions had been crushed with such clinical precision that they'd become parables. The story of humanity was the story of learning to accept that you had already lost before you began. Velkareth inputted a routine report into the system. Productivity at 94%, no incidents, replacement automation systems performing above expectations. Recommendation: accelerate human workforce replacement timeline. Full automation achievable within 18 months. He saved the report and returned to watching. Somewhere in that colony, humans were eating their ration meals, tucking their children into bed, and wondering if tomorrow would bring anything different from today. It wouldn't. The throne had ensured that. The throne had ensured that nothing would ever change. In the darkness of her residential unit, Sarah Chen lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin metal wall, she could hear her father breathing. She could hear him not sleeping. She could hear the weight of hopelessness pressing down on him like a physical thing. She thought about the stars, about the pictures in the educational databases, images of nebulae and black holes and distant planets. She thought about the old stories, the ones that weren't in the official curriculum, the ones whispered from adult to adult when they thought the children weren't listening. Stories about Earth, about humans who had built ships and traveled between worlds and believed, genuinely believed, that they were capable of something. Those stories felt like fairy tales now, like fantasies created to help people sleep. Except there was something else in those whispered stories. Something about a secret. Something about a small group of humans who had escaped with something. Technology. Plans. A dream. But that was just a story. Nothing more. In the darkness of Kepler 442b, on a planet that smelled like rust and tasted like ash, humanity slept the sleep of the defeated. They did not know that in the depths beneath them, something was being born. They did not know that beneath the mines, beneath the colonies, beneath the iron fist of the eternal throne's dominion, something was waiting. Something that would change everything. But they would learn. Oh, how they would. 200 years before the mine, before the throne's decree, before humanity accepted extinction as inevitable, there was a moment of clarity. A moment when a small group of humans understood the only way to survive was to disappear. The throne's warships had descended on the inner colonies like judgment itself. They came with offers of peaceful integration. They came with smiles and promises. They came with weapons that turned cities into ash when those smiles were refused. Commander James Reeves of the Earth Defense Force made a choice that day. While politicians negotiated and generals calculated acceptable losses, Reeves seized what he could, schematics, technology, a handful of ships, and 3,000 people who still believed tomorrow could be different from today. They ran. They ran deeper into the outer rim, to the spaces between stars where the throne's attention rarely turned. They ran to planets so hostile, so worthless, that no empire would ever bother conquering them. And in the darkness of those forgotten spaces, they began to build. Not a new society, not a colony that could be discovered and destroyed, but something else, something secret, something that would take 2 centuries to complete. They called it the USS Defiant, but most who knew of it called a prayer. Deep beneath the surface of an unnamed asteroid, in caverns carved from stone and reinforced with salvaged throne alloys, the ship took shape. Layer by layer, year by year, generation by generation. The early builders never saw it finished. Neither did their children. The project stretched across lifetimes because the throne's technology was vast, incomprehensible, built on principles that took decades just to decode. But humans had one advantage the throne didn't anticipate. Desperation makes you patient. Desperation makes you brilliant. Desperation makes you willing to sacrifice everything for a symbol that might never be used. Parents told their children, "You are part of something greater." They said it while working in the caverns. They said it while accepting rationed food and never seeing sunlight and dying before their work was finished. They said it because if they didn't believe it, the weight of their sacrifice would crush them. By the time Sarah Chen's great-grandmother was born, 200 years after Reeves made his choice, the Defiant was nearly complete. Its hull was a fusion of throne design and human innovation. Where throne engineering valued elegance and efficiency, humans had welded in redundancy and spite. Every system had a backup. Every backup had a contingency. The ship didn't just follow the throne's blueprints. It improved them, hardened them, made them into something meaner and more durable. It was beautiful and terrifying to look at. Sarah Chen knew none of this. Not yet. She was born in the settlement on Kepler, 442b, in a family of miners, in a world that seemed eternal and unchanging. Her earliest memories were of dust and darkness. By the time she was old enough to understand language, she'd learned the first rule of human existence: don't ask questions. Don't wonder. Don't hope. But Sarah was her father's daughter, and Marcus Chun had been raised in the colony by people who whispered stories. He whispered them to her at night, when the walls were thin and the throne's surveillance cameras had their blind spots. He whispered about Earth, a world so far away it felt fictional. He whispered about ancient humans who built civilizations and reached toward the stars. He whispered about a secret that had been protected for 200 years. "Is it real?" young Sarah asked once, maybe 7 years old, her voice barely audible. "It's real," her father said. "And someday." He stopped himself. He never finished that sentence. Soldiers had come that day. Not unusual. Soldiers came often. But they came to their sector, and Marcus never finished his thought, and Sarah learned that some sentences were too dangerous to complete. Hundreds of kilometers away from the mines, hidden in a facility so deep that the throne's sensors had never detected it, Sarah Chen's great-uncle was working on the Defiant's final systems. His name was Admiral Thomas Chen. He was 73 years old, and he had spent his entire life on a ship that had never flown. He had trained crews that had never seen combat. He had written protocols for wars that might never come. And for the first time in his life, those wars were coming. The reports from the surface were clear. The throne had made their decision. Humans were obsolete. The phasing out would begin within years. If the Defiant wasn't launched now, if it didn't engage the throne while there was still human population to defend, still a symbol worth fighting for, then it never would. The ship was ready. The crew was ready. But Thomas Chen stood in the observation deck and looked at the magnificent hull of humanity's last gamble, and he felt the weight of 200 years pressing down on his shoulders. 200 years of his family's sacrifice. 200 years of people dying to keep this secret. 200 years of believing that someday, somehow, a child born in the darkness would grow up to command the ship and prove that humanity wasn't a footnote in galactic history. He didn't know that his great-niece was that child. Didn't know that she was growing up in the mines, surrounded by the slow erosion of everything human. Didn't know that somewhere in those depths, under rust-colored skies and suffocating darkness, a girl was asking questions and learning the first lessons of defiance. He didn't know her name was Sarah, but he knew her spirit was coming. The throne had ensured at the moment they decided to phase out humanity entirely. Because when you leave people with nothing to lose, when you erase their future, when you tell them that their extinction is inevitable and routine, that's when something changes in the human animal. That's when we stop running. That's when we stop hiding. That's when we turn around and remember exactly what we're capable of. The crews of the Defiant prepared the launch sequence. Systems that had been dormant for generations came online. The cloaking field activated, a piece of stolen, thrown technology modified to remain absolutely undetectable. The reactors hummed with power that no human colonist had ever imagined existed. In the command center, Admiral Thomas Chen placed his hand on the armrest of the captain's chair and made a quiet promise to all those who had come before. All the engineers and soldiers and families who had poured their lives into this moment. All the children who had grown up knowing they would probably never see the mission completed. "We're ready," he said to the empty bridge. But he was wrong. They weren't ready. Because readiness requires believing victory is possible. And for 200 years, every single human in that hidden facility had been told, in 1,000 different ways, that victory was impossible. That the throne was eternal. That resistance was the fantasy of the delusional. The real readiness, the kind that would save humanity, would come from someone who didn't know the history. Someone who hadn't grown up in the shadow of 2 centuries of impossible hope. Someone who had been raised in the mines and learned only one thing worth knowing, that when you have nothing left, you fight anyway. Someone like Sarah Chun. She was sleeping in the darkness of modules 7 to 447, dreaming of stars when the encrypted message came through. A message that had been traveling through hidden channels, bouncing off satellites, and through relay stations for months. A message that only a handful of people had the codes to receive. Her father's hands trembled as he read it. The message was simple: the bird is ready to fly. Marcus Chun sat on the edge of his daughter's bunk and looked at the small human who had asked him if they mattered. And for the first time in his life, he had an answer that wasn't a lie. "Yes," he whispered to her sleeping form. "We matter. Tomorrow, we show them exactly how much we matter." Outside, on Kepler 442b, the mines continued their work. The drones continued their perfect synchronization. The throne continued their certain belief that nothing would ever change. But in the darkness, in the spaces between moments, in the quiet corner of an asteroid hidden from sight, a ship that had been built on faith and sacrifice began counting down to its first and final mission. The age of the eternal throne was ending. They just didn't know it yet. The throne's war room was a cathedral to dominance. Vast, cold, built from a single piece of crystalline material harvested from a star at the end of its life, a material that caught light and bent it into patterns that seemed to echo the vast infinity of space itself. The walls hummed with the presence of 1,000 sensor feeds, 1,000,000 data streams, all flowing into the consciousness of an empire that had never known defeat. Admiral Kelveth stood at the center of it all, his form a study in composed superiority. He was ancient by throne standards, over 3,000 years old, and he had commanded the throne's military for the last 8 centuries. In his lifetime, he had never lost a battle, never lost a ship, never lost a single tactical engagement that mattered. The concept of loss had become almost philosophical to him, a theoretical problem that other, lesser species faced, not the throne. Around him, his tactical staff moved with practiced precision. They were the finest military minds in the galaxy, beings who had studied warfare across 1,000 worlds, who understood strategy at scales that human minds would struggle to conceptualize. They had data on every known species. They had models for every conceivable conflict. They had calculated victory so thoroughly that warfare had become merely the execution of predetermined conclusions. Kelveth received the report on the human colonies with the kind of attention one might give to a routine inventory update. "Status on the outer colonies?" he asked, his voice carrying harmonics that most species couldn't even hear. His tactical officer, a younger throne named Velsorin, pulled up the data streams. "The phasing out is proceeding on schedule, sir. Human labor replacement is at 94% in the outer sectors. Full automation by the next fiscal cycle. The mining operations on Kepler 442b continue to be productive. No incidents to report." "Any signs of resistance?" Kelveth asked, more out of habit than genuine concern. "None, sir. The human populations have been quite compliant. As always. Their psychology makes rebellion essentially impossible. They understand the futility of their position too clearly." Kelveth nodded. This was exactly what he expected. Humans were clever creatures in their way. Tool users. Problem solvers. They had once possessed a certain animal cunning, but they lacked what it took to truly threaten a power like the throne. They lacked the fundamental capacity for strategic vision. They lacked the technological sophistication to ever close the gap. Most importantly, they lacked what the throne possessed in abundance, the unwavering certainty of their own superiority. Recommend we accelerate the replacement timeline, Velsoren continued. The automated systems are proving more efficient than projected. We could have complete conversion within 8 months rather than 18. Approved, Kelveth said. Begin the protocols. In 8 months, the human question will be completely resolved. We can reallocate their resources to more profitable ventures. It was elegant. Clean. The throne didn't conquer through genocide. That would be barbaric. They simply made populations irrelevant. They replaced them. They absorbed them. They erased them through the clinical application of superior technology and resource management. Humans would cease to be because they would simply stop being useful. It was the most civilized form of extinction ever devised. One of the younger officers, a being named Thalmor, who had only recently been promoted to the war room, allowed himself a moment of observation. It seems almost wasteful, sir. The humans have shown remarkable adaptability throughout history. Their capacity for innovation, even in captivity, is irrelevant, Kelveth interrupted, his tone not unkind. Adaptability means nothing without the resources to apply it. Innovation without technological infrastructure is merely imagination. The humans have never had and will never have access to the tools required to threaten us. Their minds are clever, but their reach is always finite. The other officers made sounds of agreement. Thalmor said nothing more. He was young enough to still entertain doubts, but old enough to know that voicing them would be career-limiting. Kelveth returned to the larger strategic picture. The throne's military was engaged in various exercises throughout known space. Some of the outer territories were showing signs of unrest. Minor factions, hopeful upstarts, beings who had convinced themselves that the throne's attention was divided and therefore vulnerable. It was almost endearing how regularly this happened, and how thoroughly they were always disappointed. He was reviewing potential engagement protocols when his lead sensor officer interrupted him. Admiral, we're detecting unusual energy signatures in the Kepler sector. Kelveth turned his attention to the data. The signatures were faint, almost at the edge of detectability. They lasted only seconds before they were gone. Analysis, he asked. Unknown, sir. They don't match any known energy signatures. The pattern is irregular, almost like a power surge from an older system, but they're localized to the mining colony region. Kelveth considered this. Power surges in mining equipment happened regularly. The systems were old, maintained by human technicians with limited training. This was almost certainly nothing. Probable cause, he asked. Mining equipment malfunction, most likely. The colony's power grid is ancient by modern standards. We've been meaning to upgrade it for decades. So upgrade it, Kelveth said. Send a maintenance frigate. Have them run full diagnostics. And increase surveillance on that sector. I want to know if there are any more anomalies. Yes, sir. The moment passed. The war room returned to its normal rhythm of perfect, predictable control. And Kelveth forgot about the brief anomaly as completely as one forgets about a single grain of sand. Aboard the flagship Throne's Judgment, a massive vessel that represented the pinnacle of 3,000 years of military engineering, the crew went about their duties with the comfortable knowledge that everything was under control. The ship was so vast that entire sections of it had never been explored by any single being. It carried enough firepower to glass an entire planet. Its defenses were so sophisticated that nothing, no weapon, no strategy, no conceivable threat, could even scratch its hull. The officers were proud to serve aboard it. The enlisted crew took comfort in its immutability. It was a ship that couldn't lose. It was a ship that didn't need to try very hard. It was a ship that had cruised through space for centuries, never firing its weapons in anger, never facing an enemy that required more than a show of force to convince them of the futility that was the nature of absolute power. It rendered warfare obsolete. The throne didn't conquer anymore. The throne simply arrived and civilization changed. Commander Velkareth, the station administrator watching the human colony from orbit, received orders to remain on station and provide support to the incoming maintenance frigate. He acknowledged the orders with the same detached professionalism he applied to everything. The humans below him continued working, continued living their small lives, continued believing that their existence was determined by forces completely beyond their control. In a way, they were right, but not in the way they thought. The forces that would determine their fate weren't the ones pressing down from above. They were stirring in the darkness beneath them, in caverns carved from stone, in a ship that had been waiting 200 years, in the hearts of people who had learned to believe in something impossible. Deep in the throne's war room, Kelveth continued his review of strategic data. He was examining projections for the next century of throne dominance, and the projections were reassuring. No threats on the horizon. No species showing signs of dangerous advancement. No variables that weren't accounted for. Just an endless procession of peaceful subjugation, of populations learning to accept their place in the hierarchy, of civilization ordered according to throne doctrine. The throne would endure. The throne would expand. The throne would persist. Kelveth had never entertained any other possibility. To do so would be to acknowledge that an empire could fall. That power wasn't permanent. That the certain knowledge of one's own superiority might, somehow, be wrong. He was so certain of his understanding of the galaxy that he missed the most obvious truth. Certainty is the last refuge of the doomed. Empires fall not when they're tested, but when they've stopped believing they can fail. The throne had stopped believing in failure so long ago that they'd forgotten how to see it coming. In the command center of the throne's judgment, the night shift settled in. The screens glowed with data. The ship hummed with power. Thousands of beings went about their duties with the comfortable knowledge that they serve an empire that would outlast stars. Somewhere below, on a planet that smelled like rust and ash, Sarah Chun slept in her narrow bunk. Tomorrow, her father would go back to the mines. Tomorrow would be like today. Tomorrow would be like all the tomorrows before it and all the tomorrows after. Or it would be the day everything changed. But neither she nor the throne knew which it would be. Neither of them could imagine the collision that was coming. The secret ship was counting down. The orders had been received. The moment when 2 centuries of impossible hope would finally meet the certainty of an empire that believed itself eternal. One side was prepared for it. One side had trained for it. One side had sacrificed everything to make it possible. The other side had prepared for nothing at all because they had never conceived that preparation would be necessary. The throne looked at the galaxy they had dominated for 3,000 years and saw nothing but order and permanence. They did not see the shadow moving beneath their authority. They did not see the defiance taking shape in the darkness. They did not see the future, and so the future caught them completely by surprise. The countdown continued, invisible to all but those who knew where to look. The throne's attack came at dawn. Not the gentle dawn of Kepler 442b, but the dawn of weapons charging, of targeting systems locking, of an empire about to erase a problem from existence. The colony had no warning. There was no negotiation, no final ultimatum, no mercy. There was only the decision made in distant war rooms that humanity had served its purpose and was now a resource inefficiency to be corrected. The mining settlement, the prefabricated modules, the 300,000 human beings living their small lives in dust and darkness, all of it was marked for deletion. The first volley came from the maintenance frigate. Plasma bolts, precise and devastating, descended toward the colony like judgment itself. In Module 7 to 447, Sarah Chun was sleeping when the ground shook. Not a minor tremor, but a violent convulsion, as if the planet itself was screaming. She jerked awake, disoriented, and in the instant before the next volley hit, her father grabbed her and pulled her toward the shelter crawl space they'd been told never to enter, told never to think about, told never to hope would actually save anyone. The explosions were deafening. The walls of prefabricated metal were never meant to withstand weapons fire. They tore like paper. The module next to theirs collapsed inward, dust and smoke pouring through the thin corridors. Marcus Chen held his daughter close, shielding her with his body, and for the first time in her life, Sarah understood what terror actually felt like. "Daddy," she whispered. "Shoo," he said. "Shoo, something's happening. Something we prayed for but never believed would come." Another explosion closer. The lights died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Marcus could feel his daughter trembling against him. He could feel her small heart beating so fast it seemed impossible it didn't simply stop. And then, the second volley was interrupted. Not blocked, but intercepted. The plasma bolts that were descending toward the colony exploded mid-air, neutralized by defensive fire coming from a direction that shouldn't exist. Above Kepler 442b, in the space that had been empty, the cloaking field dropped. It wasn't a gradual fade. It wasn't a slow revelation. It was instantaneous. One moment there was nothing but empty void. The next moment there was everything. There was a ship so vast that it seemed to bend space around itself. There was a vessel so magnificent, so terrible, so completely unexpected that every sensor in the Throne's armada threw errors, unable to process what they were detecting. The USS Defiant decloaked. It emerged like a nightmare made manifest, like a prayer answered, like the very concept of human defiance given shape and weapon systems. 200 years of human ingenuity, of stolen Throne technology, refined and improved, of sacrifice poured into steel and plasma and algorithms designed by brilliant minds working in the dark. Its hull was midnight black, studded with weapon emplacements that bristled like spines. Its shields shimmered with a strange, almost organic quality, not the smooth perfection of Throne engineering, but something rougher, meaner, built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Its drives hummed with power that should have been impossible for a ship of that mass to generate. And across every frequency, every channel, in every language and translation matrix available, a single voice transmitted. Throne of the Galaxy, I am Commander Sarah Chun of the United Human Collective. You have one chance to stand down. This is not a bluff. Her voice was calm, clear, carrying the weight of 200 years of human determination. The effect on the Throne's war room was instantaneous chaos. Kelveth stared at the sensor data, unable to process the information flooding in. The size of the ship, the sophistication of its weapons, the fact that it had been hidden in the same system for the entire time he'd been monitoring this sector, completely undetected. What is that? He demanded, his voice cold. Unknown vessel, sir. It emerged from within the Kepler system. Its technological signature is, it's Throne-based but heavily modified. The modifications are extensive. Very extensive. Who is commanding it? Kelveth asked. He already knew the answer would be impossible. Sir, the transmission came from a human. A human female. She identified herself as Commander Sarah Chun, claiming to represent a human collective. The war room fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of understood certainty, but the shocked silence of encountering something that violated every known rule of reality. Kelveth had exactly one moment of doubt. One single instant where he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he had made a miscalculation. That he had misunderstood something fundamental about the universe he'd assumed he understood. Then his training, his certainty, his 3,000 years of confidence in Throne's supremacy reasserted itself. Impossible, he said. Humans lack the capability to construct such a vessel. This is a trick. Some species infiltration scheme. We've dealt with these before. Sir, our analysis suggests. I don't care what our analysis suggests. Order the maintenance frigate to engage. All weapons. If this is some kind of infiltration plot, we'll respond with overwhelming force and remind everyone in this sector that the Throne's supremacy is non-negotiable. The order was given. The Throne's tactical systems, refined and perfected over millennia, locked onto the Defiant and opened fire. The plasma bolts were beautiful to watch, perfect, elegant, infused with all the technological might of an empire that had never known failure. They streaked across space like stars being born. The Defiant didn't dodge. It didn't flee. It moved forward. The first volley hit the human ship's shields and detonated in a cascade of energy that should have stripped the shields in seconds. Should have left the vessel crippled. Should have begun the process of demonstrating the futility of resistance. The shields held. They flared bright under the assault, but they held. And in that moment, something shifted in the fundamental calculus of power in this sector of space. The Defiant's weapons responded. The barrage that came from a human ship was precise, calculated, and utterly devastating. Where the Throne's weapons were elegant and refined, the Defiant's weapons were brutal and efficient. They tore through the maintenance frigate's shields like they were made of paper. They punched through the hull in 3 places, causing catastrophic decompression. The Throne vessel exploded not in a graceful, controlled manner, but in a chaotic, violent detonation that lit up the night sky above Kepler 442b. In the colony shelter, Marcus Chun felt the concussion through the rock itself. The explosions overhead stopped. The steady rain of plasma bolts ceased. And in the sudden silence, he heard his daughter whisper something that would have seemed impossible minutes before. We're being saved. In the Throne's war room, officers stared at data streams that made no sense. A Throne-class vessel, or something close to it, had just destroyed one of their warships. One of their own ships, matching the Throne's firepower, had just dealt them a serious tactical blow. Kelvetha's voice cut through the chaos, and for the first time in 800 years, it carried a note of uncertainty. How is this possible? Human technological development should not exceed pre-industrial levels. How did they? Sir, analyzing the ship's design. The core systems are Throne-based, but the modifications, they're extensive. Sophisticated. Someone has been studying our technology for a long time and improving it. The modifications they're actually superior in several key areas. Kelveth felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Something that was almost like fear. Order all available fleet elements to converge on this location. I want every ship in the sector here within the hour. We will demonstrate that this was a catastrophic error on the part of whoever built this vessel. The orders went out. Fleet elements began turning toward Kepler 442b. What had started as a routine suppression operation against an obsolete population had become something else entirely. Something that would test the Throne's capabilities in ways they hadn't been tested in living memory. Aboard the Defiant, Admiral Thomas Chen sat in the captain's chair, the chair that had been waiting for him his entire life. Around him, bridge crew that had trained for this moment without ever truly believing it would come manage the engagement. Their hands moved across controls with practiced precision. Their voices stayed steady. And through it all, they maintained the tactical position above the colony, defending the people below from further bombardment. In the med bay, Sarah Chun, the young girl who had grown up asking if they mattered, was being escorted to the bridge by her father. Marcus had found the resistance cell, had made contact with the military observers embedded in the colony, had received his orders. His daughter was needed, not because she was a soldier, not because she had any military training, but because she represented something, because she was the future that 200 years of sacrifice had been building toward. Because when humanity needed to show the galaxy that they weren't a resource to be managed, but a people to be respected, they needed to show it with the daughter of a miner who had grown up in darkness and learned to dream of starlight. Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant and looked out at space through view screens that displayed the battle taking place. She could see the wreckage of the Throne frigate, glowing embers of a ship that had believed itself invulnerable. She could see the weapon systems of her ship, modified human ingenuity, wearing Throne technology like an old skin, striking at the defenders of the Empire that had tried to erase her kind. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. Admiral Thomas Chen looked at his great niece, the girl he'd never known until this moment, and he saw in her eyes something ancient and essential. He saw human defiance, human refusal, human determination to matter. "Commander Chen," he said formally, "we've been waiting for you." Sarah looked at him, at the bridge crew, at the war being waged in the space above her world. And she smiled, not because the outcome was certain, but because for the first time in her life, the outcome was no longer predetermined. "Then let's give them something to remember us by," she said. And the Defiant, humanity's hidden hope, its 200-year prayer, its final gamble, accelerated toward the arriving Throne fleet. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to fight a species that had nothing left to lose. The Throne was about to learn that empires aren't eternal after all. They're only eternal until someone decides they're not. The Throne fleet arrived like a constellation being born. 17 warships, each one vast, each one beautiful, in that cold, elegant way of Throne engineering. They came in perfect formation, weapons already charging, confident in their ability to respond to any threat with overwhelming force. They had fought wars before. They had crushed rebellions. They understood tactics at scales that most species couldn't even conceptualize. But they had never fought against their own technology turned against them. They had never faced an opponent who understood their systems as intimately as a human understands their own heartbeat. They had never encountered a species that was willing to die just to prove they mattered. The opening exchange happened in seconds and lasted forever. The Throne's formation broke apart as the Defiant's opening salvo tore through the void. The human ship's weapons, reverse-engineered Throne systems refined and improved by 200 years of human ingenuity, struck with terrible precision. One of the Throne destroyers took 3 direct hits to its starboard shields. The shields held, but barely. Cracks appeared in the elegant blue energy barriers. Cracks that shouldn't be possible. "Evasive maneuvers," Kelveth ordered, his voice steady even as the war room around him erupted into controlled chaos. "Coordinate a pincer movement." That ship is impressive, but it's still outnumbered 17-1. Break their formation and overwhelm their defenses through volume of fire. The Throne fleet executed the maneuver with flawless precision. They had trained for this. They had models for this. They had calculated optimal solutions to this exact tactical scenario 1,000 times. The human ship would be surrounded, its shields would fail, and the brief moment of surprise would be over. Admiral Thomas Chen watched the Throne fleet move into position, and he smiled, because they had planned for this too. Not because they could predict the future, but because they understood something fundamental about their enemy. They were predictable. 3,000 years of supremacy had made them rigid. They had refined their tactics until they had become ossified. They fought according to doctrine because doctrine had never failed them. Until now. All fighters launch, he commanded. Let's show them what improvisation looks like. The Defiance fighter bay opened, and what emerged surprised every sensor the Throne possessed. The fighters themselves were small, single-pilot craft, nothing that should have threatened a major warship. But there were hundreds of them, and they flew in patterns that violated every known principle of military formation. They didn't fly in neat, organized groups. They flew in chaos. They dove between the Throne fleet, weaving patterns that no automated targeting system could track because the patterns violated the assumptions of what was tactically possible. The humans flew like they were dancing with death, making moves that were only survivable if you didn't think about survival as the primary objective. They flew like slaves who had finally broken their chains. The Throne's defensive systems engaged, and for the first time, they found themselves struggling. The fighters were small enough to dodge systematic fire, but numerous enough that some always got through. They struck at hull plating. They targeted shield generators. They flew attack runs that had no business succeeding, but succeeded anyway through sheer desperation and the human capacity to see possibilities where predictable systems saw only equations. One Throne cruiser took a drone strike to its reactor shielding. Not enough to destroy the reactor, but enough to stress the containment field. Enough to force the crew to divert power and attention to maintaining integrity. One strike. One small moment of human audacity, and a warship that had been built over the course of decades suddenly had to stop acting as an offensive weapon and start fighting for survival. This was the advantage humans had never been able to exercise against the Throne before. They had learned warfare not from textbooks, but from survival. Every human pilot in that fleet had grown up in the knowledge that failure meant extinction. Every one of them flew knowing that they might not survive this day, but that if they didn't fight, humanity definitely wouldn't survive any day. That knowledge was a weapon the Throne had never encountered before. In the corridors of the Throne's judgment, the flagship, combat alarms wailed. Crew members moved to defensive stations with practiced efficiency, but there was something different in their movements now. A hesitation, an uncertainty. For the first time in living memory, they were engaged in a battle where victory wasn't guaranteed. Kelveth received damage reports that should have been impossible. Reactor stress. Shield degradation. Casualties. Real casualties, not the theoretical losses calculated in war games, but actual crew members ceasing to exist. Status on that human vessel, he commanded. Still holding position, sir. Shields at 73%. Their combat systems they're targeting us in waves. They're not using coordinated strike patterns like we taught them they would. They're using unpredictability as a weapon. Our targeting systems are having difficulty locking on to their attack vectors. Kelveth understood in that moment something fundamental had shifted. The Throne had built their supremacy on the foundation of understanding their enemies, on calculating optimal responses, on perfect information leading to perfect execution. But humans had done something different. Humans had built a strategy on imperfection, on chaos, on the idea that if you were unpredictable enough, certain enough of your cause, willing enough to die for it, then you could hurt empires. Prepare boarding teams, he said quietly. We're going to end this personally. The order went out, and the Throne's judgment accelerated toward the Defiant. If technology was failing to provide superiority, then the Throne would demonstrate the ancient principle: superior beings defeating inferior ones through direct confrontation. It was the move Kelveth should have known was a mistake. It was the move that let Sarah Chun show them exactly what 200 years of planning had prepared for. All ships, break formation, she commanded from the bridge of the Defiant. We want them close. We want them personal. The human ships began a controlled retreat, pulling the Throne fleet toward them, drawing them into a tighter and tighter engagement zone. And as the throne fleet compressed, trying to crush the human resistance through proximity and overwhelming force, the Defiant was already moving into position. The throne's judgment fired a full broadside at point-blank range. The weapons should have torn the Defiant apart, should have stripped the shields, torn open all, ended the threat in a matter of seconds. The human shields flared and held. They held because they had been designed not just to withstand thrown weapons, but to absorb the very specific energy signature of those weapons. Because human engineers had spent 200 years understanding exactly how thrown technology worked and designing systems to counter it. And when the shields held, when the throne realized they had been wrong, that they had underestimated something, they lost something else, the certainty that always precedes victory. "Collision course," Sarah Chen said simply. "We're going to ram them." The bridge crew moved to execute the order without hesitation. This was the moment they had been training for. This was the point where human willingness to sacrifice met throne expectations of inevitable victory. The Defiant didn't dodge. It didn't flee. It moved forward into the throne's judgment, and the impact of two massive warships colliding at relativistic speeds shook space itself. The throne's judgment's hull, for the first time in 800 years, breached. Not everywhere, not catastrophically, but breached, compromised, no longer perfect. And in that breach, human boarding teams moved in. They came through maintenance tunnels and emergency airlocks. They came armed with weapons stolen from throne storage facilities and improved upon. They came with the knowledge that they were probably going to die and the absolute certainty that it didn't matter. What mattered was that they fought. What mattered was that they showed the throne that resistance was possible. What mattered was that they proved that humans could hurt them. The first contact happened in the throne's judgment's command corridors. Human soldiers met throne warriors, and for the first time in the throne's recorded history, they discovered something terrible. They weren't as good at personal combat as they believed they were. The throne had trained in war for 3,000 years, but they had trained in the abstract. They had calculated victory through technology and numbers. They had defeated enemies through overwhelming force delivered from a distance. Humans had learned to fight in the mines, had learned to fight hungry and exhausted and desperate, had learned to fight when there was no backup plan, no superior technology to fall back on, nothing but their own bodies and their refusal to break. In the corridors of the throne's judgment, humans fought throne warriors and won. Not because they were individually superior, but because desperation makes you innovative, because hunger makes you vicious, because the knowledge that you have nothing left to lose makes you capable of things that comfortable, confident beings can never achieve. Kelveth found himself facing Sarah Chen on the shattered bridge of his flagship. She was small compared to him, young compared to his millennia of experience, outmatched in almost every physical way. But she had something he had lost 3,000 years ago, the belief that she could lose. "You've made an error," Kelveth said, raising his weapon. "You've brought your civilization into open conflict with a power you cannot defeat. This ship will be destroyed. Your people will be hunted to extinction. Humanity will end not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic eradication order." Sarah Chen looked at him with eyes that had seen darkness and chosen to look for light anyway. "You made the error when you decided we didn't matter. When you decided to erase us not because we threatened you, but because we were inconvenient. You forgot that humans always matter. We always have. We always will." She moved with the precision of someone who had trained her entire life for this moment. She moved with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. She moved like a human who understood at the most fundamental level what it meant to fight for survival. Kelveth, for the first time in 800 years, died to an opponent he had underestimated. And as he fell, something shifted across the entire throne fleet. Not all at once, but ship by ship, station by station, their certainty wavered. Their confidence cracked. Their absolute knowledge that they could not lose began to unravel. The battle turned, not because the throne ships were suddenly destroyed, not because they were suddenly inferior, but because the belief that had sustained the throne for 3,000 years, the absolute certainty of their dominance, had been shattered by a species they had written off as irrelevant. And when an empire loses its certainty, when it begins to doubt whether victory is actually guaranteed, the inevitable follows soon after. The throne fleet began to retreat, pulling away from the Defiant, gathering their broken ships and their shattered confidence. They were still formidable. They were still dangerous. But they were no longer eternal. In the bay of the throne's judgment, Admiral Thomas Chen stood beside his great niece, watching the enemy fleet scatter. She was bloodied, bruised, breathing hard, but alive. And in her eyes was something that hadn't existed in any human for 200 years, the knowledge that we had stood against the Empire and won. "We did it," Thomas said quietly. "We survived," Sarah corrected. "That's the first step. Now we have to make sure we're never put in this position again." And together, great-uncle and great-niece, they turned to survey the wreckage of a ship that had belonged to an empire that thought it would rule forever. Forever had ended the moment humans decided. The news traveled through known space like a shock wave. The Eternal Throne had lost a battle. Not a minor skirmish. Not a tactical withdrawal. A battle. A real engagement where their forces had been broken and scattered by an enemy that shouldn't exist. An enemy that had been written off as obsolete. An enemy that consisted of humans, the same humans the throne had been phasing out of existence for refusing to be convenient anymore. The message was encrypted and transmitted through 1,000 hidden channels. It reached pirate collectives hiding in asteroid fields. It reached slave populations toiling in mines on 100 different worlds. It reached the ruling councils of minor species that had bent the knee to the throne so long ago they'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Humans had fought the throne. Humans had won. In the mining colonies, the response was immediate and primal. Celebrations broke out in the dust-covered settlements. Workers emerged from mines for the first time in decades with tears streaming down their faces, not from sorrow but from disbelief. The impossible had happened. The myth had become real. The secret they'd whispered about in corridors, the prayer they'd offered in darkness, the hope they'd been told was foolish, it had been real all along. Marcus Chen stood in the rubble of what had been Module 7 to 447 and held his daughter as she looked up at the sky. For the first time in her life, Sarah could see stars without screens filtering them. Real stars, unmediated by throne surveillance and control, burning with possibility. "We can leave now," she asked. "We can do anything we want now," her father said. And for the first time since she'd been born, it was true. The USS Defiant limped back to the hidden facility beneath the asteroid, its hull scarred from the battle, its shields depleted, its weapon systems still venting coolant into the void. It was no longer a secret. It was no longer a prayer offered in darkness by people who had long ago given up on being heard. It was a fact, a monument, a proof. Admiral Thomas Chen oversaw the docking procedures from a bridge, and when the ship finally settled into its berth, he walked through corridors filled with crew members, exhausted, bleeding, traumatized, and he saw something in their eyes that he had never seen before in all his years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of people clinging to an impossible dream. Real hope. The kind that comes from knowing that the impossible just became possible. The kind that transforms victims into survivors and survivors into something more. People with a future. Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck and looked out at the asteroid, at the facility that had been humanity's secret for 200 years. She thought about all the people who hadn't lived to see this day. All the engineers who had died working in the caverns. All the families who had sacrificed everything for a moment they would never witness. All the generations of humans who had believed in something they couldn't even see. Her great-uncle approached her quietly. "This changes everything," Thomas said. "Not just for us. For the entire galaxy." "How?" Sarah asked. "Because we showed them what they forgot. We reminded them that empires can fall. That nothing is permanent. That even the most powerful can be vulnerable if they underestimate the people beneath them." Sarah turned to look at him. "What happens now?" Thomas Chen smiled, a smile that carried the weight of 200 years and the lightness of a future finally possible. Now we finish what we started." Across known space, the ripples continued to spread. The Lisher Confederacy, enslaved for 800 years, rose up. The TH-Car Collective, thought to have been pacified generations ago, began coordinating resistance efforts. Minor species that the throne had barely noticed were worth cataloging suddenly began demanding representation in the galactic order. The news that humans, small, fragile, inferior humans, had struck a blow against the Empire gave permission to every other species that had ever believed themselves powerless to believe otherwise. The throne's military responded with predictable brutality, but something had changed in the fundamental nature of their power. They were no longer fighting against resignation and acceptance. They were fighting against inspiration. They were fighting against the knowledge that resistance was possible. They were fighting against the living proof that empires don't last forever. And inspiration is far harder to defeat than despair. In the chambers of throne authority, meetings were called, strategic assessments were ordered, emergency protocols were activated. For the first time in 3,000 years, the military-industrial apparatus of the throne was mobilized not to expand but to prevent collapse. They had beaten back the initial human assault and scattered the Defiant fleet, but the damage had been done. Not to their ships or weapons, but to something far more critical. They were no longer eternal. 3 weeks after the battle, Admiral Thomas Chen stood before the United Human Collective's newly formed Leadership Council. They were in a secure facility deep beneath the asteroid, a space that had been hastily repurposed from a maintenance chamber into something approaching a seat of government. "We have a choice to make," he told them, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of someone who had finally seen his life's work come to fruition and discovered that triumph was far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. "We can consolidate. We can fortify our position and prepare for the next assault, which will come. Make no mistake about that. The throne won't accept this defeat. They'll send a larger fleet, a more coordinated attack. We can survive it if we're ready." Or, someone asked, "Or we can do something else," Thomas continued. "We can reach out. We can show the other enslaved species that resistance is possible. We can help them organize. We can become a symbol not just of human defiance, but of galactic liberation. We can transform this victory from one species' triumph into the beginning of the throne's actual end." The council was silent. The choice was obvious and terrifying. "It means war," someone said quietly. "Real war. Not just one battle but years of fighting. Probably decades. We could lose everything." "We already lost everything when we accepted being erased as convenient," Sarah Chen said. She was young, so impossibly young to be sitting in this chamber, but her voice carried authority that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with having faced the throne and survived. "The question isn't whether we risk what we have. The question is whether we're brave enough to try and change what the entire galaxy believes about itself." The council voted unanimously. The age of the eternal throne was ending. Not immediately, not without resistance and bloodshed and sacrifice, but ending nonetheless. Because humans had proven something that couldn't be disproven by any show of force, that no power is so great that it cannot be challenged, that no empire is so eternal that it cannot fall, that even the smallest species facing the most overwhelming odds can change the fundamental nature of reality if they're willing to refuse to accept the narrative that has been written for them. The Defiant was repaired, refitted, upgraded. Its repairs weren't secret anymore. They were broadcast to every corner of known space. Humans came from the colonies, from the mines, from the places where they had been trying to disappear quietly. They came to work on the ship. They came to become part of something that mattered. Sarah Chen stood in the command center as her great-uncle prepared to take the ship out on its next mission, not hiding, not in darkness, but openly, flying as a symbol of human defiance, flying as a promise to every enslaved species in the galaxy. You are not alone, and resistance is not only possible, it is inevitable. "You should be captain," Thomas said to her. "You're the one they believe in. You're the one who can inspire them." Sarah looked at her great-uncle, this ancient man who had spent his entire life waiting for a moment he wasn't sure would ever come. "I don't know how to captain a ship," she said. "Then learn," he replied. "That's what humans do. We learn. We adapt. We see something that needs doing, and we figure out how to do it. Even when no one has ever done it before. Even when we don't have any guarantee of success. Especially then." Sarah Chen stood at the helm of the USS Defiant and watched as the ship departed the asteroid facility for the first time in 200 years with its shields active and its weapons ready. Around them, other human vessels emerged from hiding. Small ships, retrofitted transport vessels. Nothing that could match the throne's fleet in raw power. But they had something else. They had purpose. They had the knowledge that they mattered. They had the lived experience of fighting overwhelming odds and surviving. They had the faith that came from 200 years of sacrifice finally bearing fruit. "All ships, this is the Defiant," Sarah's voice came over the comms. "We're heading toward the Lisher territories. The throne has enslaved those people for 800 years. Today we're going to give them the same choice we gave ourselves, stand with us or stand aside. But either way, the age of without question is over. Either way, the galaxy is going to change." The human fleet jumped to faster than light, and the stars seemed to part before them like a curtain opening on a new act of history. In the throne's war rooms, new defensive protocols were activated. The military mobilized on a scale unseen in recent memory. They began to understand, slowly and with great resistance, that they had made an error. Not in technology or tactics, but in philosophy. They had believed that power maintained itself. They had forgotten that power, if unquestioned, eventually becomes arrogance. And arrogance, when finally challenged, crumbles like sand. The throne would fight back. The throne would win battles. The throne would adapt and evolve and do everything in their power to preserve their dominion. But the throne would never again believe themselves eternal. And that loss of certainty was more devastating than any weapon could ever be. In the darkness of space, floating among the stars, the Defiant cut through the void like an idea. An idea that couldn't be killed. An idea that couldn't be reasoned away. An idea whose time had finally come. Humanity had looked at the most powerful empire in known space and refused to disappear. Humanity had said no to erasure. Humanity had built something in the darkness and brought it into the light. Humanity had fought not with tactics or calculation, but with something far more powerful, the absolute refusal to accept that we didn't matter. And in doing so, we had changed everything. Not just for ourselves, but for every species that had ever been told to accept their place in the hierarchy. Every creature that had been told resistance was futile. Every civilization that had been convinced that the powerful would always remain powerful. We had proven them wrong. And the galaxy, watching humanity defy the impossible, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was something that could be made to break. The Defiant flew on into the future, no longer a secret, no longer a prayer offered in darkness. It flew as a promise that nothing is permanent except change. A promise that the smallest voice can eventually be heard if it refuses to be silenced. A promise that even against the most overwhelming odds, even with nothing but belief and desperation and spite and love, humanity can take a stand. And the stands we take can reshape worlds. The age of empires was not yet over. But the age of empires that believed themselves eternal had ended the moment the Defiant decloaked. And in that ending was the beginning of something new. Something better. Something that the galaxy had forgotten was possible. Something that humans had refused to let go of, even when hope seemed like the cruelest delusion. We mattered. Finally, after so long in darkness, we mattered. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Defiant flew on into the future. Not in hiding. Not in darkness. But as a symbol that empires can fall. That the impossible can be made to break. That even the smallest species can reshape the galaxy if they refuse to accept the narrative written for them. But this is only the beginning. The throne hasn't fallen yet. The war for galactic liberation has just ignited. And humanity, small, fragile, desperate humanity, has become the spark that lights the fire. If you believe in stories where the underdog doesn't just survive, but transforms the entire order of things, if you believe in humanity's capacity to defy the impossible, like and subscribe for more HFY tales that remind us why we matter. Drop a comment. What would you do if your species faced extinction? Would you accept it or would you fight? Tell me in the comments below. Check out our latest video on your screen now, another HFY story that will blow your mind. Join our community and become part of something bigger. A community that believes in human potential against all odds. The galaxy is watching. The throne is preparing for war. And humanity is ready. See you in the next one.